The air in the grand ballroom of the Beauregard plantation was thick with the scent of magnolias and expensive French perfume, a cloying sweetness that clung to the humid Louisiana night. It was the autumn of 1854. Outside, the cypress trees dripped with Spanish moss, silent witnesses to the opulence within. Inside, hundreds of candles threw flickering, golden light across the polished cypress floors, illuminating the silks and velvets of Louisiana's most esteemed Creole society. The music from the string quartet was a delicate, hypnotic waltz, a sound of refined celebration. At the center of it all were the bride and groom, Elodie Devereaux and Julian Beauregard. She was a vision in white lace, her dark hair coiled perfectly, her expression serene, almost unnervingly placid. He was the very picture of a Southern gentleman, handsome, powerful, his smile radiating a possessive pride. This union was more than a marriage. It was the merging of two dynasties, a consolidation of land, wealth, and influence that would echo for generations. As they began their first dance, the guests watched with admiration. The couple moved with a practiced grace, a perfect tableau of aristocratic love. But those closest to the dance floor might have noticed something odd, a tremor in the bride's hand, a fleeting darkness in her eyes that the candlelight could not touch. The gentle sway of the dance continued, lulling the room into a state of warm contentment. Then, for a single, horrifying beat, the rhythm broke. It happened in the space between one note of the waltz and the next. One moment, Julian was smiling down at his new bride. The next, his eyes widened in disbelief, a gasp catching in his throat. A dark crimson flower began to bloom on the pristine white of his shirt, directly over his heart. Elodie's hand, the one that had been resting so delicately on his shoulder, was no longer there. In it, she held a small, wickedly sharp stiletto, its silver handle inlaid with mother-of-pearl. The glint of the blade was the last thing many guests registered before the screaming began. The music faltered, screeching to a discordant halt. The idyllic scene shattered into 1,000 pieces of raw, primal panic. Julian Beauregard, heir to one of the largest sugar fortunes in the state, staggered backward, his hands clutching the wound as blood seeped between his fingers. He collapsed onto the dance floor, his fall a heavy, sickening thud that silenced the room. For a long moment, nobody moved. They could only stare at the bride. Elodie Devereaux stood over her husband's body, her white dress now splattered with his blood. Her expression was not one of panic or fear or remorse. It was a mask of cold, terrifying calm. The stiletto dropped from her fingers, clattering onto the floorboards. The sound broke the spell. Chaos erupted. But the question that hung in the air, more chilling than the groom's dying breath, was not how, but why. What could possess a bride, in the most public and celebrated moment of her life, to commit such a macabre and horrifying act? The answer to that question was a forbidden secret, buried deep in the mud and blood of the Louisiana soil. A secret that would turn this high society wedding into a legendary cold case. To understand the events of that night, one must first understand the world from which they sprung. Antebellum Louisiana in 1854 was a land of stark, unforgiving contrasts. It was a place of immense beauty and even greater cruelty. The Creole aristocracy, of which the Beauregards and Devereaux were pillars, lived in a gilded cage of their own making. Their lives were governed by a rigid code of honor, tradition, and public perception. They built their magnificent plantation homes on the backs of the enslaved, their fortunes watered by the sweat and blood of others. This was a society obsessed with appearances, where a carefully constructed facade of piety and gentility concealed a world of unspoken sins and brutal realities. The Devereaux family, while old and respected, had seen their fortunes wane in recent years. Their land was rich, but their coffers were not. Elodie, their eldest daughter, was their most valuable asset. She was renowned for her beauty and her quiet, dignified demeanor, the perfect porcelain doll to be bartered for security. The Beauregards, by contrast, were a force of nature. Their wealth was immense, their influence absolute. Julian was their only son, a man groomed from birth to inherit and expand an empire built on sugar cane and human lives. The marriage between Elodie and Julian was, therefore, a transaction cloaked in the language of love. It was a strategic alliance, a masterpiece of social engineering designed to secure the futures of both families. No one thought to ask if the bride was a willing participant. In their world, her feelings were irrelevant. She was a daughter, then a wife. Her duty was to be beautiful, to be silent, and to obey. But something in Elodie Devereaux had refused to break. Something had festered beneath that placid surface, a darkness that was about to consume them all. The investigation, if one could call it that, began almost immediately, though it was doomed from the start. Sheriff Beauchamp, a man who owed his position to the patronage of the Beauregard family, arrived on the scene to find a ballroom in disarray. Guests were being ushered out, women were fainting into the arms of their husbands, and servants were frantically trying to clean the blood that had stained the priceless cypress floorboards, a futile attempt to erase the horrifying memory of what had transpired. Julien Beauregard had been pronounced dead before he was even carried from the room. The stiletto, the murder weapon, was secured as evidence. It was an antique, a Devereaux family heirloom passed down to Elodie by her grandmother. This fact alone seemed to seal her guilt. There could be no doubt she had brought the weapon with her, concealed somewhere in the voluminous layers of her wedding gown. But the motive remained a terrifying void. When Sheriff Beauchamp approached Elodie, he found her seated in an antechamber, guarded by her stunned father and brother. Her blood-stained dress had been covered with a shawl. She was silent, her gaze fixed on a point on the far wall, seemingly oblivious to the chaos she had caused. The sheriff's questions were met with a profound, unnerving silence. She would not speak. She would not confess. She would not explain. This was not the behavior of a scorned lover or a woman driven to a crime of passion. This was something else, something colder and more deliberate. It was this disturbing lack of emotion that became the first stone in the foundation of her legend. Was she a mad woman, her mind having snapped under the pressure of the wedding? Or was she something far more dangerous, a cold-blooded killer hiding behind the guise of feminine fragility? The truth was far more macabre than either of those possibilities. In the days that followed, the official narrative began to take shape, crafted carefully by the powerful hands of the Beauregard family. The story they presented to the world was one of tragic, inexplicable insanity. Elodie Devereaux, they claimed, was afflicted by a female hysteria, a fragile disposition that had shattered on her wedding day. Newspapers, heavily influenced by Beauregard money, printed sorrowful accounts of a beautiful young bride whose delicate mind had given way to a violent madness. Doctors were produced, men who had never met Elodie, to speculate on the mysterious ailments of the female psyche. It was a convenient explanation, one that painted Julien as the blameless victim and transformed Elodie from a murderer into a pathetic, pitiable creature. This narrative served a crucial purpose. It preserved the honor of both families. It avoided the scandal of a public trial, the airing of dirty laundry, and the potentially damaging questions that a proper investigation might raise. Julien Beauregard could be buried a martyr, and Elodie Devereaux could be made to simply disappear. Her family, the Devereaux, were caught in an impossible position. To challenge the Beauregards was to invite financial and social ruin. To defend their daughter's sanity was to admit she was a murderer. And so they acquiesced, their silence bought with the promise that their daughter would be cared for, not punished. She would be sent away to a private asylum far from New Orleans where she could live out her days in quiet seclusion. The case was to be closed, the marriage annulled, the horrifying incident scrubbed from the official histories, but whispers are not so easily silenced. Among the servants, the enslaved, and the superstitious folk of the bayou, a different story was being told. A story not of madness, but of a curse. A forbidden tale of a groom who was not a victim, but a monster. The whispers began in the slave quarters, carried on the humid night air like spores of a contagion. They spoke of things the white masters refused to see, of a darkness that had clung to Julien Beauregard long before his wedding day. They said he was a man with two faces. In the grand houses of New Orleans, he was charming and sophisticated. But on his plantation, far from the prying eyes of society, he was a different man entirely. The stories told by the enslaved were of a cruelty that went beyond the casual brutality of the era. They spoke of punishments that were not just severe, but ritualistic, of disappearances that were too frequent to be coincidence. They spoke of a small, hidden cabin deep in the cypress swamp, a place the overseers were forbidden to approach, a place from which screams were sometimes heard at night, only to be swallowed by the chorus of insects and frogs. This cabin became the heart of the burgeoning legend. It was said to be a place of macabre rituals, of forbidden practices brought over from the old country and T.W. Isted into something new and horrifying. The servants at the Devereaux home had also noticed a change in Elodie in the months leading up to the wedding. She had grown withdrawn, prone to long silences and sleepless nights. Her personal maid, a young woman named Celeste, confided in others that Elodie had been plagued by nightmares. She would wake up screaming, drenched in a cold sweat, speaking of a man with no shadow and a debt that must be paid in blood. Celeste herself vanished without a trace just a week before the wedding. The official explanation was that she had run away, but those who knew her said she was loyal to a fault. She would never have abandoned her mistress, especially not then. Her disappearance was another thread in a tapestry of dread, a disturbing detail that hinted at a much larger and more horrifying picture. The forbidden history of Julien Beauregard was a secret kept locked away, but like all rot, it seeped out at the edges. While society saw a charismatic air, a darker reputation festered beneath the surface. There were rumors of his travels to Haiti and Cuba, not just for business, but to study the darker forms of Vodou and Santeria. Not for faith, but for power. These were not the folk traditions practiced by the enslaved for protection or healing. This was something else, a perversion of the old ways, focused on control and malevolence. It was said he belonged to a secret society, a small, exclusive cabal of wealthy Creole men who dabbled in the occult. They believed that through certain forbidden rituals that required unspeakable sacrifices, they could secure their fortunes, bend others to their will, and even prolong their own lives. These were, of course, just rumors, the kind of ghost stories told to frighten children. But they persisted, clinging to the Beauregard name like the ever-present Spanish moss. It was said that the family's incredible luck, their ability to weather storms, crop failures, and market crashes that ruined other planters, was not due to business acumen, but to a pact made with dark forces. An old curse was said to haunt their bloodline, a consequence of this pact. It promised immense prosperity, but it demanded a terrible price from each generation. The nature of this price was a closely guarded secret, known only to the heads of the family. But with Julian's death, many began to wonder if Elodie hadn't just murdered a man, but had interfered with something far older and more sinister. Had she stumbled upon the family's macabre secret? Was her violent act not one of madness, but a desperate, calculated attempt to break a curse? The stabbing in this light was not just a murder, it was an exorcism. As the official story of Elodie's madness was being cemented in the public record, a few dissenting voices dared to question it. One of these was a young, ambitious journalist named Thomas Reed, who ran a small, independent newspaper in New Orleans. Reed was an outsider, a northerner who viewed the Creole aristocracy with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. He didn't believe the sanitized version of events. The image of the calm, silent bride did not square with the portrait of a hysterical madwoman. He began to dig, discreetly interviewing servants who had been dismissed from the Beauregard plantation and speaking with disgruntled former business associates of Julian's. What he uncovered was a pattern of disturbing behavior. He heard tales of Julian's explosive temper, his vindictive nature, and his unsettling obsession with collecting macabre artifacts. One source, a former clerk, told Reed about a locked ledger that Julian kept, separate from the official plantation books. This ledger, the clerk claimed, did not record transactions of sugar or molasses, but of something else. He had only caught a glimpse of it once, but he saw strange symbols drawn in the margins and lists of names, names of enslaved people who had later vanished. The official records of this night were sealed, some say banned from public view. If you believe some histories should never be buried, subscribe to our channel, because the truth we've unearthed is far more horrifying than the legends. Reed became convinced that the key to the mystery lay in what Elodie knew. He tried to gain access to her, to petition the Devereaux family for an interview, but he was met with a wall of silence. The families were closing ranks, intent on burying the truth along with Julian Beauregard. The search for a concrete motive led investigators, and later journalist Thomas Reed, to Elodie's private chambers in the Devereaux family home. They were looking for a confession, a diary, a letter, anything that could explain her horrifying actions. At first, they found nothing. Her room was immaculate, a testament to her orderly and disciplined nature. But tucked away in a small, locked rosewood box, they found a collection of letters. They were not from a secret lover, as some had hoped, which woe. Aldous provided a simple, albeit scandalous, motive. They were from her younger sister, Amandine. Amandine had died a year prior, swept away by a sudden fever that had baffled the city's doctors. Her death had devastated Elodie, who had been exceptionally close to her. Reading the letters, a disturbing picture began to emerge. In the months before her death, Amandine had been secretly courted by none other than Julian Beauregard. The letters spoke of his charm, his lavish gifts, but also of a growing fear. He was possessive, she wrote, and prone to fits of jealousy. In her final letter, written just days before she fell ill, Amandine's tone was one of sheer terror. She wrote of a promise Julian had forced her to make, a ritual he had made her participate in at his swamp cabin. She described a strange ceremony involving a circle of stones, cryptic chanting, and a blood oath. She begged Elodie to help her to find a way to break off the courtship without incurring his wrath. "He is not what he seems," Amandine had written. "There is a hunger in his eyes. I fear he means to consume me." A week later, she was dead. The Devereaux family had accepted the doctor's diagnosis of yellow fever, but now, holding this letter, it was clear that Elodie had not. She believed her sister had been murdered. Amandine's final, terrified letter recontextualized everything. Elodie's silence was not a sign of madness, but of cunning. Her placid demeanor was not a symptom of hysteria, but the icy calm of a woman bent on a singular, terrible purpose. She had not killed her groom in a fit of passion. She had executed her sister's murderer. This arranged marriage, which her family saw as a salvation, must have felt like a monstrous joke to her. She was being forced to marry the man she believed had destroyed her sister. Every smile, every dance lesson, every dress fitting in the months leading up to the wedding would have been an act of exquisite torture. She was trapped, with no legal recourse and no one to turn to. In the patriarchal society of 1854 Louisiana, a woman's accusation against a man as powerful as Julian Beauregard would have been dismissed as fantasy. Her own family, desperate for the financial security of the marriage, would have silenced her, so she crafted a different kind of justice. She would wait until the moment of his greatest triumph, when he stood before the whole of their society, basking in his power and success. She would let him believe he had won, that he had possession of the Devereaux family and its last remaining daughter. And then, in that moment of ultimate public validation, she would destroy him. The wedding was not a celebration. It was a stage. The first dance was not a consummation of love, but the final act of a revenge tragedy that she had written herself. The use of her family's heirloom stiletto was not a coincidence. It was a symbolic act, justice delivered by the hand of the family he had wronged. But this revelation, as shocking as it was only the surface. The nature of Amandine's death, the ritual she described, pointed to a darkness that went far beyond a simple crime of passion. The mystery of the swamp cabin deepened. Spurred on by the contents of Amandine's letter, Thomas Reed hired a local guide, a Cajun trapper who knew the bayous like the back of his hand, to find the hidden location. The Beauregard overseers had tried to dismantle it after Julian's death, to erase its existence, but traces remained. Deep in the swamp, miles from the main house, they found it. The cabin was small, windowless, and built of dark, aging cypress wood. The air around it was unnaturally still, the usual chorus of the swamp strangely muted. The door had been torn from its hinges, but the inside was even more disturbing. The floor was packed earth, and in the center was a dark, indelible stain that even the rains had not washed away. But it was the carvings on the interior walls that were most horrifying. They were a bizarre mix of symbols, some resembling traditional Vadu Vive, others of a seemingly European occult origin, and some that were entirely alien. They were not drawn with paint, but etched into the wood and in many places stained with a dark reddish-brown substance that could only be dried blood. In a rotten floorboard, Reed found a small, leather-bound journal. It was Julian's. The handwriting was elegant, but the content was the stuff of nightmares. It was a logbook, not of plantation business, but of his occult experiments. He wrote of his attempts to contact entities to gain power over life and death. He documented his rituals, his sacrifices, small animals at first, then larger ones. And then, chillingly, the entries grew more vague, referring only to the vessel or the offering. He wrote of a belief that by taking the life force of a young, healthy individual at the peak of their vitality, he could cure the sickness in his own blood, a reference perhaps to the liege. Enderi family curse. Julian's journal was a descent into madness and depravity. It confirmed that he was not just a dabbler in the occult, he was a fanatic, a man who truly believed he could cheat death and destiny through blood sacrifice. He wrote of Amandine Devereux with a chilling detachment, referring to her as the perfect vessel. He believed her purity and vitality were exactly what his ritual required. He detailed his seduction of her, his psychological manipulation, and the final, horrifying ceremony in the swamp cabin. He described forcing her to drink a potion that induced a high fever and paralysis, mimicking the symptoms of a disease. He believed he had successfully drained her life essence to bolster his own, to keep the family curse at bay. Her death, which everyone had accepted as a tragic illness, was a meticulously planned ritual murder. The journal laid bare the full, macabre truth. But it also revealed something more. Julian had not intended to stop with Amandine. In the final entries, written in the weeks before his wedding, he began to write about Elodie. He wrote of his admiration for her strength, her resilience, her fire. He believed that, as his wife, she would be an even more powerful vessel. The marriage was not just for social or financial gain. In Julian's twisted mind, it was a way to gain ultimate ownership of her, to prepare her for a future sacrifice. Elodie was not just marrying her sister's killer, she was marrying her own. She was being led to the slaughter, and the grand wedding was merely the prelude. The question that now burned in Thomas Reed's mind was, how much did Elodie know? Did she find proof? Did someone tell her? Or did she simply sense the same evil that her sister had? The answer, Reed suspected, lay with the one person who had vanished just before the wedding, Celeste, Elodie's personal maid. Celeste was more than a servant, she was Elodie's confidant, raised alongside her since childhood. Her disappearance a week before the ceremony was too convenient. Reed began to search for her, a task that was nearly impossible. A runaway slave, if that's what she was, would have gone to ground, leaving no trace. But Reed suspected she hadn't run at all. He spoke to other servants, and a story emerged of Celeste's growing fear of Julian Beauregard. She had seen the way he looked at Elodie, an intensity that went beyond a groom's affection. It was a look of appraisal, like a butcher eyeing a prize animal. It was Celeste who had found Amandine's hidden letters after her death and given them to Elodie. It was Celeste who had sat with Elodie through the night as she wept, not just from grief, but from a growing, horrifying realization. And according to one kitchen maid, it was Celeste who had followed Julian one night, suspecting he was unfaithful. She had followed him not to the home of a mistress, but deep into the bayou towards the swamp cabin. She was never seen again. It was almost certain that Julian had discovered her, that she had seen something she was not meant to see, and that he had silenced her permanently. Celeste's disappearance was the final piece of the puzzle for Elodie. It was the confirmation of her deepest fears. With her only ally and witness gone, she was utterly alone, trapped in a gilded cage with a monster. The wedding date loomed, not as a day of joy, but as an execution date. She had no way out except for the one she made herself. This new, terrifying context transforms the scene in the ballroom from a simple, shocking murder into an act of profound, desperate courage. Every step Elodie took that day was weighted with the knowledge of her own impending doom. The white wedding dress was not a symbol of purity, but a shroud. The vows she exchanged were not of love, but a death sentence. Her calm demeanor was not madness, but the steely resolve of a soldier marching into a battle she knew she might not survive. She had to conceal the stiletto within the intricate layers of her gown, a cold piece of steel against her skin, a constant reminder of the grim task ahead. She had to smile, to accept congratulations, to play the part of the blushing bride, all while knowing she was in the arms of the man who had murdered her sister and intended to do the same to her. The first dance was her only opportunity. It was a moment of manufactured intimacy, the one time she could be certain to get close enough, with the eyes of the world upon them, ensuring there would be witnesses. Her action was not just about revenge for Amandine, nor was it solely about self-preservation. It was about exposure. By striking him down in the most public way imaginable, she ensured that the pristine facade of the Beauregard family would be shattered forever. She knew she would be condemned, either as a madwoman or a murderer. She knew she would lose her family, her freedom, and her future. But in that one violent act, she became the author of her own fate. She refused to be a silent victim, another offering to the darkness that haunted the Beauregard name. She chose to become a monster to kill a monster. Thomas Reed now held a story that could tear the Creole aristocracy apart. He had Julian's journal, the testimony of former servants, and the powerful motive locked within Amandine's letters. But he faced a formidable obstacle, the combined power of the Beauregard and Devereux families. They controlled the courts, the press, and the levers of power in New Orleans. To publish his story would be to invite ruin. He would be branded a liar, a sensationalist, and his newspaper would be crushed. The families were already working to completely erase Elodie from history. The asylum they had chosen for her was the infamous St. Vincent's Retreat, a place known for its brutal methods and for its discretion. Patients who entered St. Vincent's were often never heard from again. It was a place where inconvenient people were sent to be forgotten. The official transfer was arranged in the dead of night. There was no public record, no court order. Elodie Devereux, now stripped of her married name, simply vanished from the world. Her own family, in a final act of self-preservation, agreed to the arrangement. They chose their own survival over their daughter's freedom, perhaps convincing themselves that the madness narrative was true, as the alternative was too horrifying to contemplate. The story was officially closed. The bride was insane. The groom was a tragic victim. The darkness was swept back under the rug, and the gilded society of New Orleans breathed a collective sigh of relief. But Reed was not so easily deterred. He believed the truth had a right to be heard, no matter the cost. Reed decided to publish. His article, a sprawling, multi-part exposé, was a bombshell. He laid out the entire Macabre story, Amandine's letters, the swamp cabin, the forbidden rituals described in Julian's journal, the disappearance of Celeste. He painted a portrait of Julian Beauregard not as a gentleman, but as a predatory occultist and murderer. He framed Elodie's act not as one of insanity, but as a calculated act of justice and survival. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The Creole elite was scandalized. The Beauregard family used all of its immense influence to discredit Reed. They bought out rival newspapers to print scathing attacks on his character and his journalistic integrity. They claimed the journal was a forgery, the letters taken out of context, the servant testimonies lies bought with Northern money. Sheriff Beauchamp officially denounced the story, producing a signed confession from a petty thief who claimed to have robbed and murdered the maid, Celeste, a confession clearly obtained under duress. The pressure campaign was relentless. Reed's advertisers pulled out. His distributor refused to carry his paper. He received anonymous threats. His press was vandalized in the middle of the night. He was a lone voice crying out against a conspiracy of silence, and the establishment was determined to crush him. The public, for the most part, sided with the powerful. It was easier, more comfortable to believe the story of the mad bride than to accept that a man from one of their most prominent families was a monster. The story was just too disturbing, too horrifying to be true. The Beauregard family's counteroffensive was largely successful. Thomas Reed's newspaper folded within a month. Disgraced and financially ruined, he was forced to leave New Orleans. His explosive story was relegated to the status of a fringe conspiracy theory, a piece of sensationalist gossip that was eventually forgotten by all but a few. The official narrative, the story of Elodie's tragic madness, became the accepted history, but Reed had managed to plant a seed of doubt. The story he had unearthed never fully vanished. It went underground, transforming into a piece of dark folklore, a ghost story told in hushed tones around firesides and in shadowy corners of taverns. The legend of the Blood Bride of the Bayou was born. They said that on the anniversary of the wedding, if you stood near the ruins of the old Beauregard plantation, you could still hear the faint sound of a waltz, abruptly cut short by a single, piercing scream. They whispered that the ghost of Elodie, her white dress forever stained with blood, haunted the swamps, searching for justice that she was denied in life. The swamp cabin became a forbidden place, believed to be cursed. Locals claimed that strange lights could be seen there on moonless nights, and that anyone who ventured too close would be driven mad by whispers from the shadows. The story, now untethered from Reed's journalism, grew wilder and more supernatural with each telling. This is where the story splits into two paths, one of madness and one of a curse. To see which one leads to the macabre truth, make sure you're subscribed as we descend into the heart of this Louisiana de Arness. And what of Elodie? Did she truly spend the rest of her life locked away in St. Vincent's retreat? The records of the asylum from that period are notoriously incomplete, and many were lost in a fire in the early 20th century. There is no official record of an Elodie Devereaux ever being a patient. Of course, it's almost certain she would have been admitted under a false name to ensure complete anonymity. For decades it was assumed she had died there, a forgotten soul in a place designed for forgetting. But another, more tantalizing possibility exists. One of the last people to see Elodie before she vanished was a young orderly who helped transport her to the asylum carriage. Decades later, as an old man, he recounted the story to his grandchildren. He said the bride was silent the entire journey, her eyes showing no fear, only a burning intelligence. As they neared the asylum, the carriage was ambushed on a dark, lonely road. It was not a robbery. The figures who emerged from the trees were silent and moved with purpose. He spoke of a tall woman, a free person of color known in the local community as a powerful voodoo priestess. She and her followers disarmed the guards without a word, opened the carriage door, and offered a hand to Elodie. According to the old man's tale, Elodie looked at the priestess, a silent understanding passing between them. She stood up, left the carriage, and vanished into the swamp with her rescuers, never to be seen again. This alternate version of events, if true, suggests a hidden network of resistance operating in the shadows of the plantation system. The enslaved and the free people of color in the region had their own systems of justice, their own ways of dealing with men like Julian Beauregard. Celeste, Elodie's maid, was known to have family among the community of the voodoo priestess, Marie Laveau's contemporary. It's possible that before she was killed, Celeste had managed to get a message out, warning her community about Julian's activities and his intentions for Elodie. Julian's perverse use of their sacred traditions would have been seen as a profound blasphemy, a dangerous corruption that had to be stopped. His macabre rituals, his sacrifices, would have marked him as an enemy to those who practiced the true voodoo. In this light, Elodie's act in the ballroom was not a solitary one. It was the spark that ignited a pre-planned response. Her public execution of Julian was a signal. The community, led by the priestess, may have seen Elodie not as a murderer, but as an instrument of justice, a vessel for their collective vengeance against a man who preyed upon them. Rescuing her from the asylum was not just an act of compassion, it was an act of solidarity. They were protecting one of their own, an unlikely ally who had done what they could not, strike at the heart of their oppressor in his own home, in front of his own people. This interpretation paints a picture of a silent, invisible war being fought just beneath the surface of Creole society. The fate of the two families in the years after the incident is a testament to the destructive power of their secrets. The Beauregard dynasty crumbled. Without their charismatic and ruthless heir, the family fortune dwindled. A series of uncanny misfortunes plagued them: crop failures, mysterious fires, and shipping accidents. The old whispers of a family curse resurfaced with a vengeance. Many believed that Elodie's stabbing of Julian had not broken the curse, but had instead unleashed it in its purest, most destructive form. The price of the family's dark pact had finally come due, and with no one left to perform the horrifying rituals to keep it at bay, it consumed them. Within a generation, their vast fortune was gone. The grand plantation house fell into disrepair, its windows dark and empty, its fields overgrown. The Beauregard name, once a symbol of power, became a byword for tragedy and decay. The Devereux family fared little better. Though they avoided immediate financial ruin, they were forever tainted by the scandal. They became social pariahs, their name inextricably linked to madness and murder. They lived out their lives in quiet shame, haunted by the daughter they had sacrificed to save themselves. They had chosen honor and wealth over truth, and in the end, they were left with neither. The story serves as a macabre morality tale. A house built on a foundation of secrets and blood is destined to fall. The darkness they had tried so desperately to conceal had ultimately swallowed them whole, leaving nothing but a legacy of ruin and a horrifying legend. Let us return to the weapon itself, the mother-of-pearl stiletto. In the rush to condemn Elodie, few paid close attention to its specific history. It was not merely a Devereux heirloom, it had a dark legend of its own. It was said to have been brought over from France in the 18th century by Elodie's great-grandmother, a woman who was rumored to have been a cunning woman or a witch. The legend claimed the blade was forged with a small amount of silver and consecrated under a full moon. It was not intended as a weapon of simple murder, but as a tool for cutting curses and binding malevolent spirits. It was said to be powerless against an ordinary man, but deadly to one whose soul was tainted or owned by a dark entity. If Elodie knew this family legend, her choice of weapon becomes profoundly significant. She did not simply grab the nearest sharp object. She chose a specific, symbolic tool for a specific, supernatural purpose. She may have believed that a mere bullet or a common knife would not be enough to kill Julian Beauregard, or rather, the evil that animated him. She needed something that could sever his connection to the dark forces that gave him his power. The stabbing, then, was a ritual in itself, a counter-ritual designed to undo the horrors her sister had suffered. This detail adds another layer of premeditation to her act, suggesting a mind that was not fractured by madness, but was instead operating within a different, older system of belief. A world of curses, spirits, and forbidden knowledge, where justice required not just blood, but the correct application of ritual and symbol. The question of whether Elodie escaped or was imprisoned remained a local debate for nearly a century. But in the 1970s, a discovery was made that seemed to offer a final, chilling answer. A construction crew, clearing land deep in the bayou for a new development, stumbled upon the ruins of a small, isolated cabin, miles from any known settlement. It was not the remains of Julian's ritual cabin, but something else. Inside, beneath a rotten floorboard, they found a small tin box. The contents were meager: a few silver coins, a tarnished locket containing a faded portrait of a young woman who strongly resembled Amandine Devereux, and a single folded piece of paper. The paper contained a short, unsigned letter, the ink faded but still legible. The handwriting was identified by experts as a match for Elodie Devereux's. The letter was not dated, but its message was clear. It was written to her long-dead sister, Amandine. In it she spoke of finding a strange peace in the solitude of the swamp. She wrote of being protected by kind souls who understood her actions. She mentioned learning their ways, the ways of herbs and roots, of listening to the whispers of the water and the trees. "I have paid the price for our justice," she wrote, "and I am free. I live a life you cannot imagine, far from their world of gilded cages. I hope, wherever you are free as well." The letter seems to confirm the legend of her escape and rescue. It suggests she did not just flee into the swamp, but that she found a new life there, a new identity among a community that saw her as a hero, not a monster. This discovery of the letter and locket presents a final, haunting image of Elodie. It is not the image of a madwoman locked in a cell, nor the blood-soaked specter of legend. It is the image of a survivor, a woman who was pushed to the absolute brink, who stared into the abyss of a truly horrifying evil, and who did the unthinkable to fight back. She lost everything, her name, her family, her place in the world, but she gained a raw, untamed freedom. The bayou became her sanctuary, a place whose natural dangers were nothing compared to the civilized monstrosities of her former life. The thought of this refined, aristocratic woman adapting to such a harsh environment is staggering. It speaks to an inner strength and a will to survive that is almost beyond comprehension. She became a part of the swamp's own folklore, a whispered legend among the Cajun and Creole communities of the wetlands. They called her the Dame Blanche des Marais, the White Lady of the Marsh. They said she possessed great knowledge of healing and of protection against evil. Some even claimed to have seen her, a fleeting figure in a simple white dress, moving silently through the cypress knees, a guardian of the swamp's hidden places. Her story, which began with a public act of horrifying violence, ended in a lifetime of profound, mysterious silence. She had successfully performed the ultimate vanishing act, erasing herself from a world that had tried to destroy her. The story of Elodie and Julian has been effectively banned from mainstream historical accounts of Louisiana. It is too messy, too disturbing, too disruptive to the romanticized myth of the Old South. It exposes the rot beneath the veneer of gentility, the savagery that underpinned the aristocratic code of honor. This is a history that has been deliberately suppressed, a cold case that the powerful wanted to remain frozen forever. The official records are sealed or missing. The newspaper accounts are biased and incomplete. Julian's journal, if Thomas Reed's account is to be believed, was likely seized and destroyed by the Beauregard family. What remains is a patchwork of folklore, speculation, and a few tantalizing pieces of evidence like Amandine's letters and Elodie's final note from the swamp. The tale exists in the gray area between history and myth, which is perhaps where it belongs. It is a story that defies easy categorization. Is it a true crime account of a vengeful woman? Is it a gothic romance of madness and betrayal? Or is it a tale of supernatural horror, of curses and black magic? The answer is that it is all of these things at once. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones who wear the most convincing human masks, and that sometimes the only way to fight them is to become a monster yourself. The silence surrounding this case is not due to a lack of evidence, but to a collective, societal desire to not look too closely at the darkness it reveals. Re-examining the witness statements from the wedding night with this new perspective reveals subtle but crucial details that were initially overlooked. Several guests, when pressed by Sheriff Beauchamp, described Elodie's movements during the dance as stiff and unnatural, as if she were a puppet being moved by an unseen hand. They had interpreted this as nervousness, but it could also be seen as the physical manifestation of an unbearable psychological burden. One guest, a distant cousin of the Devereaux, later told her children that she had seen Elodie's lips moving just before the stabbing. She wasn't speaking to Julian, but seemed to be whispering a prayer or perhaps an incantation. Another detail, dismissed at the time as irrelevant, was the scent of a strange, earthy perfume on Elodie, not the French jasmine she was known to wear, but something that smelled of damp earth, cypress, and a hint of something bitter, like nightshade. Could this have been a protective charm, an oil given to her by Celeste, prepared by the voodoo priestess's circle? a concoction meant to give her strength or shield her from Julian's dark influence during their final, fatal encounter. These small, fragmented observations, when pieced together, do not paint a picture of a woman losing her mind. They suggest a woman steeling herself, perhaps with the aid of folk magic, for a necessary and terrifying ordeal. Each detail points away from random, hysterical violence and towards a deliberate, ritualistic act of retribution. The wedding was her stage, the waltz was the countdown, and the stabbing was the meticulously planned climax. The legacy of the Beauregard curse became deeply ingrained in the local psyche. After the family's collapse, the plantation lay abandoned for decades. No one dared to buy the land, believing it to be profoundly tainted. Locals told stories of trespassers who would become violently ill or suffer from relentless nightmares after visiting the property. The grand house itself slowly decayed, succumbing to the relentless humidity and encroaching vegetation of the Louisiana swamp. It became a ghoulish landmark, a skeletal ruin that served as a physical reminder of the horrifying story. In the early 20th century, a wealthy industrialist from the north, dismissing the local legends as superstitious nonsense, bought the land for a fraction of its worth, intending to restore the plantation to its former glory. The project was plagued by disaster from the start. Tools would vanish, equipment would mysteriously break down, and workers would quit, claiming to hear whispers and see fleeting shadows in the empty hallways of the house. The final straw came when the industrialist's young son fell from a second-story window, a window that had been boarded up for years. The boy survived but was never the same, spending the rest of his life in a catatonic state, staring at something no one else could see. The industrialist abandoned the project, and the land was left to rot once more. The curse, it seemed, was not tied to the Beauregard bloodline alone, but to the very soil upon which their sins had been committed. The macabre nature of the crime and the subsequent cover-up raises a disturbing question about the complicity of the community. How many people knew, or at least suspected, the truth about Julian Beauregard? It is likely that many in the Creole elite had heard the rumors about his dark proclivities but chose to ignore them. He was wealthy, powerful, and from a good family. In a society that valued appearances above all else, his sins were a tolerable inconvenience as long as they remained behind closed doors. The women of this society were particularly powerless. They were raised to be ornaments, their value tied to their purity and their obedience. If a young woman like Amandine were to be preyed upon by a man like Julian, she would have had no one to turn to. Speaking out would bring shame upon her family and ruin her own prospects. Her fear and her suffering would have been silenced, dismissed as feminine fantasy or exaggeration. Acute. Lodi's act of violence was so shocking because it was a radical, horrifying breach of this unspoken contract of silence. She refused to be a quiet victim. She refused to let her sister's death be forgotten. She took the secret, private horror of Julian's actions and thrust it into the public eye in the most brutal way imaginable. She held up a mirror to the polite, genteel society of New Orleans and forced it to look at the monster it had enabled. Her crime was not just the stabbing, but the act of telling a forbidden truth. Julian's journal, as described by Thomas Reed, contained numerous strange symbols and diagrams. While Reed was unable to decipher them, modern occult historians who have studied his descriptions have suggested they align with a particularly dark and obscure branch of European demonology, blended with a corrupted form of Afro-Caribbean traditions. Julian was not just performing folk magic. He was allegedly attempting to contact and make pacts with specific, named entities. The goal was not simply wealth or power in the abstract, but a form of parasitic immortality. The theory he was working from, outlined in his journal, was that by ritually sacrificing individuals who possessed a strong life force, vessels, as he called them, he could absorb their remaining years, staving off the degenerative curse that he believed afflicted his bloodline. This curse, he wrote, manifested as a slow decay, a withering of the soul that led to madness and an early death for the men in his family. His father and grandfather had both died young, suffering from a mysterious wasting sickness. Julian believed his occult practices were a cure, a way to cheat his inherited fate. This provides a chillingly rational, albeit psychopathic, motive for his actions. Amandine was his first successful experiment. Elodie was to be the next, a sacrifice intended to secure his health and power for decades to come. His entire life was a race against a genetic clock, a race he was willing to win by any means necessary. One final, creepy detail from the wedding night often gets lost in the drama of the main event. In the chaos following the stabbing, as guests were fleeing the ballroom, the head butler, a man named Antoine, claimed he saw something that made his blood run cold. He was in the main foyer when he saw a woman slip out the front door. He recognized her as the renowned voodoo queen of New Orleans, Marie Laveau herself, or one of her high priestesses. She had not been a guest, and no one knew how she had gotten inside the heavily guarded mansion. Antoine said she had been standing in the shadows of the hallway, watching the first dance with an intense, focused expression. She was not shocked or surprised by the violence. She watched it unfold with a grim, almost satisfied look, as if she were observing a ritual that had gone exactly as planned. As soon as Julian fell, she turned and left, melting back into the night. This account, if true, is explosive. It suggests that Elodie was not acting alone, but was part of a coordinated effort with the most powerful voodoo practitioners in the city. It implies that the spiritual leaders of the enslaved and free black community had identified Julian as a threat and had empowered Elodie, perhaps through charms, rituals, or simple guidance, to act as their champion. Her stabbing of the groom was not just a personal act of vengeance, but a spiritual execution, sanctioned and witnessed by a hidden power that resided just outside the walls of the white aristocracy's world. The story has been told and retold so many times that the line between fact and folklore has been almost completely erased. It has become a Louisiana ghost story, a cautionary tale about the darkness that can hide behind a handsome face and a powerful name. But at its heart, it is a story about a woman's desperate fight for survival. Elodie Devereaux was a product of a system designed to render her powerless, to be traded and used like property. Her rebellion against that system was not political or philosophical, it was primal and violent. She has been called a madwoman, a murderer, a witch, and a hero. Perhaps she was all of these things. She represents a fascinating and terrifying archetype, the final girl of a real-life horror story, who, instead of just surviving the monster, decides to become the monster herself to ensure he can never harm anyone again. The ambiguity of her fate is a key part of the story's enduring power. Whether she died in an asylum or lived a long, free life in the swamp, she ultimately succeeded in her goal. She vanished. She escaped the gilded cage, leaving behind only a bloody mystery and a legend that continues to haunt the dark, cypress-choked waters of the Louisiana bayou to this day. Her silence, in the end, was more powerful than any confession. It created a void that has been filled with a century and a half of fear, speculation, and whispered, forbidden stories. Let us recons. Either the title of this story, The Bride Who Stabbed the Groom During Their First Dance. It is shocking, direct, and paints a clear picture of victim and perpetrator. But after examining the dark history that led to that moment, the roles become horrifyingly reversed. The groom, Julian, was the true predator, the monster hiding in plain sight. The bride, Elodie, was his intended final victim. The wedding was the trap, and the first dance was meant to be the beginning of her end. Her violent act was not an attack but a defense. It was a preemptive strike, a desperate last-ditch effort to save herself from a fate worse than death. The ballroom was not a scene of celebration turned to tragedy, but a hunting ground where the prey, against all odds, managed to kill the hunter. This inversion of the narrative is what makes the case so profoundly disturbing. It challenges our assumptions about guilt and innocence, about madness and sanity. It forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. Can an act of brutal murder also be an act of profound justice? In the cold, rigid legal system of 1854, the answer would have been a simple no. but in the more primal court of survival and retribution, in the face of an evil that the law could not or would not touch, Elodie Devereaux delivered her own verdict. The blood on the dance floor was not the stain of her guilt, but the proof of her horrifying, and perhaps necessary, liberation. The physical evidence from the case has, of course, long since vanished. The stiletto was returned to the Devereaux family and likely hidden or destroyed. The blood-stained wedding dress was burned. Julian's journal, if it ever truly existed, is gone. The swamp cabin rotted back into the mud from which it was built. All that is left is the story itself. A story that functions as a kind of historical cold case, impossible to ever truly solve. The lack of resolution is precisely what makes it so chilling. We are left with a series of haunting, unanswered questions. What was the exact nature of the Beauregard family curse? What other horrors did Julian commit in his swamp cabin? Did Elodie truly escape? And what kind of life did she lead in the bayou? The truth lies buried with the dead, in unmarked graves and sealed family vaults. But the legend persists, a testament to the idea that some truths cannot be fully suppressed. They fester in the dark, in the whispers of the community, and eventually they claw their way back into the light, even if it is only as a ghost story. The tale of the Blood Bride is a reminder that the official histories written by the powerful are often the most elaborate fictions, and that the real, macabre truths are the ones that are banned from the books and left to haunt the collective memory. The land where the Beauregard plantation once stood remains undeveloped to this day. It is part of a state-protected wetland preserve now. The ruins of the main house are still there, though they are little more than a few crumbling brick pillars and a collapsed chimney, almost completely swallowed by vines and cypress roots. Local guides who take tourists on swamp tour will sometimes point it out from a distance, referring to it as the Ghost Plantation. They tell a simplified, sensationalized version of the story. The tale of beautiful bride went insane and killed her handsome groom. They don't speak of Amandine, or the journal, or the curse. The deeper, more disturbing truths have faded from popular retelling, deemed too complex and too horrifying for casual entertainment. But for those who know where to look, for those who have pieced together the fragments of Thomas Reed's forbidden reporting and the whispers of local folklore, the place has a palpable aura of dread. It feels like a wound on the landscape that has never healed. It is a place where the air is heavy with unspoken secrets, where the silence seems to hold the echo of a scream. It stands as a silent monument to a horrifying chapter of Louisiana's dark history, a story of love, betrayal, and macabre vengeance that is all the more terrifying because it is almost certainly true. In the end, the story of Elodie Devereaux is a chilling exploration of the nature of evil. Was the evil in Julian's blood, a supernatural curse passed down through generations? Or was it the more mundane, yet equally horrifying evil of a man given absolute power in a society that allowed him to treat other human beings as objects for his own gratification? His occult beliefs may have simply been a twisted justification for his own sadistic impulses, a grand, Gothic narrative he constructed to give his cruelty a sense of purpose. Elodie's response was equally complex. Was her act a moment of temporary insanity, as the official story claims? Was it a cold, calculated act of revenge? Or was it something more? Perhaps in order to defeat the profound evil she faced, she had to tap into a primal, violent force within herself, a darkness to fight. A darkness. The image of her standing over Julian's body, calm and silent, is perhaps the most macabre part of the entire tale. It suggests that in that moment she had transcended fear, grief, and morality. She had become an instrument of pure, unadulterated consequence, a force of nature that had risen up to restore a terrible balance. The bride in the blood-stained dress is not just a historical figure. She is a myth, a terrifying symbol of the horrifying things a person can be driven to when trapped in a world where justice is a lie and monsters wear the masks of gentlemen.